Hi everyone. In this lecture, we're going to talk about the intersection of ethics and the law. Brief overview of what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. Just sort of a general overview of this legal versus ethical thing. A couple of processes for negotiating ethical and legal conflicts. And then another process for mitigating errors. And then towards the end of the lecture, we'll talk about the autobiographical paper that is due this particular week. So this is really taken from that first Reimer paper, the 2005 paper, where he talks about social work ethics and legality. A couple of important things to note here. Generally, ethics and laws are consistent with each other. So what's ethical is also going to be what's legal, and vice versa. What's legal is also going to be with what's ethical. And generally speaking, again, these are sort of broad generalities here, but generally speaking, social workers are obedient of the laws. Most laws are not all that outrageous or not all that or not all that sort of remarkable. That it sort of permits us to be sort of generally obedient with them. The exception might be when we're advocating social justice or resisting something of that nature. And in that case, what we have to start to think about is why we're breaking the law and why we're breaking the law in favor of certain ethical principles. So we'll talk about that here in a second. But what I want to pause here and talk about for just a second is what's called normative ethics. And this is sort of a widely accepted ethical theory. Now, this isn't necessarily, ethics in this case are not necessarily the same thing as the Code of Ethics, the NASW Code of Ethics, although we can think about the Code of Ethics from sort of a normative ethical perspective, but this is sort of ethics more generally. So in normative ethics, there's sort of two orientations towards law. One is deontology and the other is teleology. And I've got them written down on the slide if you're taking notes. Deontology and teleology. So deontology is regarding laws as right and just without regard to consequences. So it's sort of as if you're saying, I've got an example here in a second, but it's sort of as if you're saying the law is the law and that justifies my actions. So let me give you an example of how we might think deontologically. Suppose you're driving a car with a friend or a family member or something like that who is very sick. They need to get to the hospital and you're taking them there. Well, you're going to go the speed limit on whatever road you're going on because the law is the law. And the law is sort of more important than your friend or your family member's health. On the other hand, so let's talk about teleology now. You probably see where I'm going with this. In a teleological perspective, the rightness of action is determined by its consequences. So a law does more harm than good, so I'm going to break the law or ignore the law. And if we use that same example, so you're driving in a car with a friend or family member who desperately needs to get to the hospital. In this case, the law is holding or preventing this person, this family member, this friend from getting treatment. So it's justified for me to ignore the law, ignore the speed limit, and get this person to the hospital so they can get so they can get the medical care that they need. So when it comes to sort of privileging the Code of Ethics, or social work Code of Ethics or laws, we have to start to think deontologically or teleologically. Now, Reimer gives us sort of four different situations where laws and ethics might be in conflict or in agreement with each other. And all I did, he doesn't do this, but all I did was sort of organize them on an axis like this. So you can get a situation, so we can, if we organize or we orient ethics on the horizontal axis and laws on the vertical axis, we get a quadrant, say the upper right-hand quadrant, where laws and ethics are consistent with each other. This is where we're going to be most of the time. What's going to be legal is going to be ethical, and what's going to be ethical is also what's going to be legal. There's three other situations where we'll find ourselves less often. That's where we need to start to think whether we're acting deontologically or teleologically, like we talked about on the previous slide. So this bottom right-hand quadrant, for example, we might have situations in which something is ethical, but it is not legal. We might end up with sort of the inverse of that, which is the top left-hand quadrant, where something is legal, but it's not ethical. And then we might end up in sort of this bottom left-hand quadrant where something is not legal and it's not ethical. So most of the time we're going to find ourselves here. So something is going to be legal and ethical. It's very rare that we find ourselves in this quadrant where things are neither legal nor ethical, and in general we don't act in unethical manners. So if we find ourselves in this situation, we probably need to get out of it very quickly. The quadrants where we're going to use sort of that deontological approach is either this upper left-hand quadrant where something's legal but not ethical, or this bottom right-hand quadrant where something is not legal but it is ethical. And that's where we need to consider those deontological and teleological approaches. So let me just move myself here real quick. So Reimer gives us 7 steps through working through times when legality and ethics are in conflict. And this is taken right from his article. So the first step is to identify conflicts between ethical and legal expectations and requirements, including the social work values and duties that are in conflict. So we're identifying conflicts between ethical and legal expectations. Second thing we're doing is we're identifying the individuals, groups, and organizations that are likely to be affected by the ultimate ethical decision. So these are the stakeholders. Third thing we're doing is we're tentatively identifying all possible courses of action and participants involved in each course, along with the risks and benefits of each course of action. And this is where sort of a lot of the work in these 7 steps comes in, because you have to think through all of the different courses of action, along with all of the people it affects in a good way and a bad way. After that, step number 4, we thoroughly examine reasons in favor and opposed to each possible course of action, considering ethical theories, ethical principles, the literature, parts of the Code of Ethics, and parts of laws. So this is where we're weighting each of the different possible courses of action. Then, let me just move the slide forward. We're consulting with colleagues. We're making a decision, and we're documenting that process, that decision-making process, and then we're monitoring and evaluating that decision. So we're going to come back to sort of what these 7 steps mean here towards the end of the conversation today. But let's now talk about Reimer's 2006 paper. And I'm just going to move myself over a little bit. So this 2006 paper is really about how ethics apply to advances in practice. Social workers in general need to be competent to use a new treatment modality. That competence generally is obtained through getting some training, some professional development or specialized training, obtaining the necessary credentialing, getting the right supervision. Part of obtaining that training might be some independent study. Typically new treatment modalities are going to require an awful lot of practice. You have to make sure you've reviewed the literature to assure that there's sufficient evidence that something is evidence-based and not just something that sounds good or sounds interesting or something that it would be helpful. And then new interventions sort of also need to pass the test of assuring cultural humility. In general, creative treatments shouldn't replace sound clinical judgment, and I'll tell you what I mean by that here in a second. What I really mean by that is what Reimer says when he says that treatment innovations that are creative or non-traditional or unorthodox are not necessarily good or effective. I think a general reasonable guideline is that as a new professional especially, you're going to be trained in some good and broadly applicable intervention methods. And so you don't really need things that are unorthodox or highly non-traditional. You can move into some of the non-traditional and slightly more cutting-edge things as you mature in age in practice, and after you've obtained some training and mastered some of the more basic and long-standing um, clinical intervention techniques. So when it comes to sort of the use of creative or non-traditional or even unorthodox interventions, there's generally two consequences for professionals if the use of a sort of creative or unorthodox intervention um, doesn't work well. There's misfeasance and malfeasance. So misfeasance is the proper act, proper intervention used at the wrong time, and then a malfeasance, which is far more common, is a wrongful act. Now, again, the good news is, let me just go to the next slide here. Oh, oops, I guess I didn't mean to go to the next slide. So the good news is that in general, like I said, your graduate training trains you in sort of ethical and long-standing intervention methods, or intervention methods that have sort of a long history and are widely accepted in the profession. It's really not until people have been practicing for a number of years that they sort of begin to catch on to some of these non-traditional and unorthodox things. And again, they can be used, and Reimer gives us a process for that. That's on the next slide. But they need to sort of pass standards in this process that Reimer gives us. So his guidelines for using unorthodox interventions I've written out here on this slide. Consult colleagues, obtain informed consent, obtain supervision, review ethical standards, review regulations and laws, review appropriate literature, obtain legal consultation, and then of course document and evaluate. The thing that he really doesn't say, that I think he probably needs to, is that unorthodox interventions are justified really when other orthodox interventions have failed. So we typically don't try the highly unorthodox things without trying the orthodox things first. And he neglects to say that, and I think that he probably should. And so again, that's something that we need to remember too, is that before we get to these highly unorthodox things, we have to have exhausted the typical, the orthodox, the long-standing interventions. This last paper that we read from Reimer this week, the 2008 paper, talks about errors in practice and how to prevent them. So he gives us three main types of errors. They are incomplete information, lying, and then avoiding or not acknowledging an error. Typically, serious errors that result in harm to client often involve some kind of investigation team. That's often a client advocate, supervisory people, sometimes legal counsel, that kind of thing. But the good news is really that the Code of Ethics helps us prevent errors, and that's why we consult it frequently and use it as a basis for our actions. We use it to justify our actions. If you haven't, I'd recommend bookmarking the Code of Ethics or ordering a print copy, although I think it's just as easy probably to bookmark it so that it's easily accessible on your computer. Oops, didn't mean to advance the slide there. I meant to move myself back here. A couple of other things to talk about this week that aren't talked about in Reimer's readings. First is duty to warn. So duty to warn is actually one of the few times a disclosure of confidential information is warranted and justified. It happens typically when a client is at risk for harming themselves or someone else. And oftentimes the person we're warning is, or the people we're warning is law enforcement or crisis services, or in the rare instances where a client says he's going to, he or she is going to harm someone else, we may be warning the person that they intend to harm. Again, good news here is that most and probably all agencies have a protocol for duty to warn. You'll become familiar with that process when you get a job at an agency. Same thing will be true for internship and things like that. You'll be acclimated or oriented towards the duty to warn process. The process is always documented. Again, that's usually covered in the agency policy, but it typically includes things like who was contacted, what was disclosed, when it happened, so on and so forth. And then often that disclosure is talked about in session with clients, so it's made into part of sort of the therapeutic process. Last thing I want to talk about here before we wrap up is sort of what's the difference between preventing harm versus harm reduction. They're really not the same thing, even though maybe on their face they look familiar. So preventing harm is stopping harm before it starts, and that's often in the context of treatment. Ethical treatment means that we don't cause any harm to our clients, and that's what preventing harm sort of means. On the other hand, harm reduction it really involves reducing harm associated with an act in which a client participates. So it might be reducing harm associated with drug use. Harm reduction occurs in specialized agencies, often treatment agencies or treatment adjacent agencies. They're often licensed, and they have sort of a special status with the state or with the licensing authority. Now, I want to be clear, both preventing harm and harm reduction have these ethical dimensions, but preventing harm is a universal ethical responsibility, while harm reduction is really only done in the context of certain kinds of work. So in this class, if you're writing about harm, and we will be here with some of these assignments in a couple of weeks, the term that you should really be using is preventing harm. Not harm reduction. That's that specialized process that involves reducing the harm associated with a particular act. So, generally, if you stick with preventing harm, you'll be on the side where you should be. So let's summarize sort of what we did this week and how this adds to sort of our knowledge and conversation about ethics. So last week we read the Code of Ethics, and again, if you haven't bookmarked it, I'd recommend that you do, because you're going to want to consult it for the duration of this class, and then really for the duration of your graduate training, and then be able to consult it when you move into practice. So we read 3 articles by Reimer, and these writings, among other things, model how the Code of Ethics can be used to develop processes that help us arrive at reasoned decisions when we're faced with sort of ethical dilemmas. And I outlined 2 of them, or I sort of echoed 2 of them here in this talk. They're not complicated processes at all. What they are is actually long processes. They require a lot of time. And both the processes that we reviewed here involve others. They involve consultation with peers, with supervisors, with legal counsel, legal counsel, that kind of thing. So they're not complicated, but they do require time, and they do require consultation with others. And that's sort of the point. Ethical decision making is not done quickly, and it's not done hastily. It's not done, it doesn't take an instant. It actually takes a very long time. The decision is made after a very thoughtful and a very reasoned process. So the things that Reimer talked about, the processes that we reviewed here and that he talks about in these articles, are actually going to serve as a model for some other decision-making processes that we're going to look at. And then one of the things you'll do for me in this class, as we move into some of the other papers, is you'll actually walk through each of the steps in a decision-making process. It might be one that Reimer's outlined or one that someone else has outlined, but you'll actually walk through each of the steps and in a paper, and then arrive at a decision and justify that decision. But the papers will be a chance to sort of work through each of the steps that that someone has outlined. So next week we move into looking at other ethical decision-making processes. Okay, let's talk about the autobiographical reflection paper here for a couple of minutes. This is, oops, advance the slide. This is Appendix B in the syllabus. I'd recommend that you go and read that section. It's just about a paragraph, half a page or so. So I'm looking for 5 sections in this paper, and then a brief introduction and a brief conclusion. So what I'm looking at, each of the 5 sections, I've listed them here. But again, I would make sure you go back and read them in the syllabus. So I'm looking for a short discussion of significant life events that have impacted your values and ethics. And make sure you're discussing how these events have shaped your own personal values and ethics. Second section should be evidence that you're demonstrating or starting to demonstrate professional behavior, professional communication, and professional appearance. And this should be relatively recent. So maybe since the start of the semester or the start of the calendar year. This should be, evidence that you've recently demonstrated or are starting to demonstrate professional behavior, communication, and appearance. Third section is biases or conflicts that may be present in your values and ethics. Fourth section is how you can maintain boundaries. You could, if you don't have any contact with clients right now, that's okay. You could talk about how you would maintain boundaries in a professional setting, looking forward. So you can sort of look into the future as well. And then the fifth section, which is probably the most robust or the longest of the 5 sections, is instances where your own values and ethics are either consistent or inconsistent with the code of ethics. So how do I grade this paper? What am I looking for? So I'm looking for insight. Are you developing a sense of self-awareness? And the emphasis here is really on developing. Developing self-awareness takes a long time, and it takes a long time to really sort of keenly develop a sense of self-awareness. It takes probably longer than the time you're in graduate school. It takes, probably years and into the first couple of years of one's professional life. So I'm looking for insight. Are you developing a sense of self-awareness? Are you starting to develop a sense of how your presence impacts others? Second thing I'm looking for, are you communicating clearly? And that's done through proofreading and revising and editing and rewriting, that kind of thing. Are you communicating with genuineness and honesty? These are sort of important social work traits, and I'm looking for you to communicate them in your writing. And then lastly, are you communicating professionally? So, excuse me, are you submitting assignments that are consistent with page length expectations? Is language professional? Are you adhering to APA style? Are you including headings and subheadings and citations and so on and so forth? Those are sort of all the things that you need to do to demonstrate professional communication. Question is, do you need to include references? So you're going to want to reference the Code of Ethics and the course text, the Barsky text. You might also choose to reference some of the readings, the PDF readings. I am okay with you using information from lectures. You do not need to reference them. We can just sort of regard that information as common knowledge, if you like. So reference the printed materials. You don't need to reference the lectures, though you're welcome to use information from them. If you do want to reference the lectures, if you do want to formally reference them, you can use my last name, Lynn, and the year 2019, and then include the information from the APA manual that the lecture that it says to include when you're citing lectures. I wouldn't penalize you for not referencing the lectures, and I wouldn't give any additional credit if you did reference the lecture. So like I said, you don't need to. So this assignment, as with all assignments in the course, is due by the end of week 5. That's Sunday at 11:59. There's a Dropbox on Moodle that you can use. You're also welcome to email it to me. Lastly, don't forget that if you have questions about this assignment, you're welcome to send me an email or give me a call. You're also welcome to post in the Ask the Instructor forum that's up at the top of Moodle. I look forward to reading these assignments as I do all of your assignments. And like I said, don't be afraid to get in touch if you have questions. Okay, thanks for watching.